and they were very successful for several years. For example, at that time, the Philippine Islands were not an independent country as they are now. It was a possession of the United States. They occupied the Philippine Islands. One of the most famous things about that, General MacArthur, who became famous for his involvement in World War II and other things later. Anyway, he was in command of the American forces in the Philippines. He retreated to Corregidor, which was a fortified island in Manila Bay, and it became obvious that the Japanese were going to take Corregidor also, so he fled by submarine, and his famous statement was, "I shall return,"
Yep.
which he did.
Yes. So
You asked earlier about if I had any relatives in the war.
Uh-huh.
I had a first cousin, Don Lark, who was in the Navy, and he was on the battleship Pennsylvania in Pearl Harbor, which was one of the battleships bombed by the Japanese, and probably the only reason he lived through it was Sunday, and he had gone ashore to go to Mass.
Oh, wow.
So he was not on the Pennsylvania when it was bombed. Another interesting thing about Pearl Harbor is the cruiser Detroit was there. Cruisers were named after cities, battleships were named after states. Anyway, the cruiser Detroit was there. Years later, in August of '45, when the American fleet, or at least part of it, entered Tokyo Bay with MacArthur to accept the Japanese surrender, they had the cruiser Detroit lead the American flotilla into Tokyo Bay because it was the only warship that had been at Pearl Harbor.
So you've been talking a lot about MacArthur. What were your views of him at the time?
Views of what?
General MacArthur?
Well, he was a big hero to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
But later on in life, he became political,
Right.
and tarnished his reputation somewhat. But he was a big hero in World War II, and rightly so, because he led the American forces to victory.
Mm-hmm. So at the time, did you have any relatives living in Europe?
Not to my knowledge. There may well have been, because our family is pretty extensive,
Mm-hmm.
and we would not know, there's dozens of them I've never met or wouldn't know if I met them.
Mm-hmm. So you were talking about how you guys were still in the Great Depression. How did the war affect your family economically?
Well, there was no trouble getting a job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So in that sense, pretty hard way to end unemployment, but it did end unemployment. Not only because of the labor needed for the war industry, but because so many of the men went into the armed forces.
Mm-hmm.
And the workforce lost several million men that way.
So, did your family talk about the fighting with you, or did they keep secrets from you?
That's a good question. I don't remember, frankly, discussing it with them.
Mm-hmm. You don't
I knew all about it, as I said earlier, because I was a paper boy and read all this stuff. But it wasn't something that parents are liable to discuss with their children.
Right.
Nor in any other war.
So, did your family have any close friends or relatives that lost their lives because of the war?
No.
No?
No.
Okay. So, let's see. Did you ever think about joining the war as a teenager?
I was too young. I think no one imagined it would, last that long.
Yeah.
As it lasted 5 years.
Yes. So how did growing up as a child during the war affect you now? Do you have any different views towards people, or, does it make you think more?
Well, I think it affected me a lot because, well, for one thing, it was easy for me to work.
Mhm.
And people talk about working their way through college. I worked my way through grammar school, high school, everything else.
Yeah.
Um, one unimportant aspect of the war is victory gardens.
Mhm.
People were encouraged by the government to start a victory garden, that is, grow their own vegetables.
Mhm.
So we had a big victory garden. We had one on a vacant lot next to our home, plus the government or the authorities, townships or cities or whatever, would take vacant land and say this space is available for victory gardeners. So you'd have dozens of people with their own little plot there.
Right.
So we had one of those too.
Okay. So, the adults explain? You said that they didn't really talk about the war, but did you know about Hitler and the Holocaust that was going on at the time?
Well, everyone knew about Hitler.
Mhm.
The Holocaust? There wasn't much publicity about it.
They didn't really talk
No.
about it.
There was very little publicity about it.
Okay.
If there was, what little there was sort of buried in all the other news about the war.
Right.
It wasn't specifically more important than anything else because they were doing so many other horrible things,
Yeah.
like the 12,000 officers, Polish officers, that the Russians rounded up in the forest in Poland and killed 12,000 Polish officers. That isn't a big country. That was the cream of their manhood.
Mm. So, I don't have any more questions today.
Okay, I hope they didn't lose that whole first part of the interview. Do you think it'll still be on here?
Yeah, it's still on there. It's just
Okay, you don't have any other questions? Do you have anything else you want to tell CJ about
Yeah.
World War II?
Can you stop that a second while I think?
Yeah, I
yeah,
think.
I'll stop it.